The jump point at Keth Narrows was 11 minutes away when Saya Thren's fighter took the hit that knocked out her dorsal stabilizer. She did not scream. Keth pilots were trained not to scream. She gripped the stick, rolled through the debris arc, and brought the shuddering fighter back onto the heading her squadron lead had plotted 12 minutes ago, before the ambush, before the 3 dead wingmates, before the realization that the Keth Dominion's jump column was not going to reach the Narrows unopposed. The stabilizer alarm cycled through its tones, and Saya silenced it by feel, her eyes already back on the tactical display, already watching the 9 small contacts that had been reordering her understanding of the universe for the past 22 minutes. 9 human fighters against 214 Keth warships. She had thought when the contact report first came in that there was a sensor error. The Keth Dominion did not fear fighters. Fighters were escort vehicles, point defense tools, threat suppression screens for capital ships. They were not, under any tactical doctrine Saya had ever studied, strategic assets. They could not stop a fleet. They could not hold a jump point. They could not, individually or in any conceivable formation, do what the 9 contacts on her display were doing, which was making it impossible for 214 warships to cross 11 minutes of space without bleeding badly enough to reconsider. The column's senior navigator had called it interference at first, then sensor scatter. Then, after 4 minutes of watching the 9 contacts methodically close every approach corridor the column's maneuvering officer tried to open, the navigator had stopped offering explanations and simply updated her avoidance plots in silence. That silence had said more than the explanations. Skywatch Lead, we are reading your formation as 7 contacts, the human command channel said. Saya's translator caught it in near real time, the voice young, crisp, entirely unafraid. Confirm you still have 9. Still 9, the lead replied. Vareth and column took cosmetic hits. We are all functional. Copy that. You have contact in 40 seconds. Saya's wing commander, Teth Vorak, had said nothing for 3 minutes. He was 41 years old and had fought in 7 campaigns. He was watching the 9 contacts too. They are repositioning again, his executive officer said. I see it. The 9 human fighters had, in the last 22 minutes, repositioned 17 times. Not randomly. Saya had pulled the pattern 3 minutes ago, had overlaid it on the tactical grid, and had spent 60 seconds staring at what it showed before she accepted that she was reading it correctly. The humans were not trying to survive. They were not running a delaying tactic in the way that Keth doctrine would define it, a fighting withdrawal, a gradual trade of ground for time. They were cycling through a set of overlapping interdiction arcs that ensured no Keth hull could accelerate toward the Narrows without crossing a kill corridor. Every time the column shifted its approach vector to open a gap, 2 or 3 of the 9 fighters slid sideways through the vacuum and closed it. They were doing this against a fleet that outmassed them by a factor Saya's tactical computer had stopped calculating after the first minute, because the disparity was large enough to be an error. The first pass hit the Keth column's leading edge at contact plus 4 seconds. Saya watched it from 4,000 kilometers port. The human lead came through the gap between the heavy cruiser immovable and the destroyer screen at an approach angle that her flight school instructors would have called physically impractical, 90 degrees off the standard intercept geometry, hull nearly horizontal relative to the ecliptic, not along any attack vector her combat training archive recognized. The ship fired twice. 2 Keth destroyers lost propulsion simultaneously. They did not explode. They simply stopped being able to accelerate toward the Narrows, which for the purposes of a jump column advance was the same thing. The lead was already gone before Keth point defense could complete a fire solution. 2 more in from the sunward arc, the human channel said, calm. Not performing calm, actually calm, the way someone is calm when the thing that is happening is the thing they planned for. Thavith, Orin, you have the cruiser screen. I am on the command hull. The command hull was the ISK Voreth Keth, 5 kilometers of Dominion plate steel, carrying the fleet admiral and everything that made coordinated fleet movement possible. It was surrounded by 17 escort ships. It was, by every convention of space warfare that Saya had ever been taught, unreachable by a single fighter. The human lead hit it with a missile spread that took out both its primary sensor arrays and its long-range communications node in the same 3-second window. The ISK Voreth Keth was not destroyed. It did not need to be. Without its sensor arrays, it could not see the Narrows approach clearly enough to plot a safe jump ingress. Without its communications node, Fleet Admiral Voreth could not relay updated jump coordinates to a column of 214 ships that needed to arrive at the Narrows in precise sequence or risk catastrophic transit scatter. The fleet slowed, not because the Admiral ordered it, because slowing was the only option that did not involve killing several thousand sailors in a misjump. "That is not possible," Teth Vorek said, "not to anyone, just to the display." Saya's stabilizer alarm started cycling again. She silenced it again. She kept watching. The other 8 human fighters were, she realized, not supporting the lead. They were not flying escort. They were each running their own, independent interdiction arc. A different targeting priority, a different corridor, a different mechanism for making forward movement expensive. One of them had spent 4 minutes doing nothing except sitting at optimum missile range of the fuel tender at the column's rear, not firing, simply being there, forcing the tender to maintain evasive posture rather than the replenishment approach the column's forward destroyers needed. The destroyers were down to 40% fuel reserves, not enough for a contested jump and a combat approach to whatever was waiting on the other side of the Narrows. Another human fighter had taken out the lateral sensor relay drones, the small automated platforms that gave the column early warning on its flanks. Not the ships, the drones. 11 targets, each one smaller than a utility shuttle, each one hit in a 17-minute window that had looked, from the Keth tactical picture, like scattered sensor noise rather than a systematic sweep. It was only now, reviewing the timeline, that Saya understood the drone kills had happened first, before anything else, and that the subsequent repositioning passes had exploited the blind arcs those missing drones had opened. The sequence had a logic to it that she was still mapping, like reading a word backwards, and only then recognizing the language. A third fighter, the one designated column in the human channel, the one that had reportedly taken a cosmetic hit, had spent the last 8 minutes flying a slow, wide ellipse around the column's port flank. Saya had not understood why until she cross-referenced it with the column's maneuvering log. Every time the maneuvering officer had attempted to shift the columns heading to port, which was the most fuel-efficient route to an alternative approach corridor, the column contact had been exactly where it needed to be to make that shift tactically inadvisable. Not threatening, just present. A door held shut by a hand that did not even need to push. The column was blind on 2 axes and low on fuel, and the Narrows was still 11 minutes away. Fleet Admiral Voreth committed his escort screen. 12 destroyers peeled out of formation at combat burn and drove toward the nearest 3 human fighters. The human fighters moved, not retreating, not fleeing, simply no longer being where the destroyers were aimed, and resumed their interdiction arcs from a different angle as the escort screen burned its reserves, trying to close with contacts that had already calculated exactly how much pursuit they could absorb before the destroyers ran dry. 2 minutes later, the escort screen turned back. They had achieved nothing. They had spent fuel they could not replace. Vorek's executive officer said quietly, "Sir, at current consumption rates, the forward screen cannot complete a contested transit." Vorek did not answer immediately. Saya watched him watching the display. She had been flying since she was 17. She had 800 combat hours. She understood at a functional level the physics of what the 9 human fighters were doing, the fuel math, the geometry, the sensor gaps they were exploiting. What she did not understand, could not quite hold in the frame of her training, was the decision that had produced this. Someone had looked at 214 warships bearing down on a jump point and had said, 9 fighters. 9 is enough. We will go. Not out of madness. She was sure of that now, watching the pattern the humans had been executing for the last 29 minutes. This was not desperation. This was not a sacrifice run. This was a plan worked out precisely, probably before the column had even entered scanner range, with contingencies for every counter the Keth fleet had attempted, and several it had not yet tried. The humans had sat down somewhere and calculated exactly how much disruption 9 fighters could generate against a fleet this size, and they had concluded, enough. We can hold the Narrows with 9. And then they had launched. Saya found, for reasons she did not immediately examine, that she hoped they were right. Column speed is down 40%, the executive officer reported. We are reading a new contact from the far side of the Narrows. The display updated. Saya pulled the reading and understood simultaneously why the 9 fighters had been doing what they were doing, and what the plan had actually been from the beginning. Skywatch lead carrier is in position, the human command channel said. You can stand down. A pause, not long, maybe 4 seconds. All Skywatch elements break and return. Good work. The contact from the far side of the Narrows was a human carrier. Not alone, flanked by 3 heavy cruisers and a destroyer screen that the passive array was still resolving, ship by ship, into a number larger than the column could handle in a fuel-compromised transit. The carrier had been waiting there since before the 9 fighters had first appeared on the tactical board. The 9 fighters had been holding the Narrows long enough for the carrier group to get into position, not to stop the column from crossing, but to ensure that crossing was no longer survivable. Fleet Admiral Voreth had not given any new orders. The column was simply decelerating. The tactical picture did not require an order. The 9 contacts began pulling back. No flourish, no victory spiral. They simply stopped flying the interdiction arcs and turned for the carrier, and as they turned, Saya could see on her extended-range scanner what 32 minutes of continuous maneuvering at those speeds had cost them in fuel. 2 of the 9 were barely making headway. Someone would need to come out and get them. The human carrier dispatched 2 rescue shuttles without being asked. Tethvorik said very quietly into the open channel, "Who were those pilots?" The question was not answered. The Keth column turned and began the long burn back the way it had come, the Narrows behind it and the carrier group holding steady at the transit point, waiting in case anyone changed their mind. Saya sat in her damaged fighter and tried to find the right category in her training archive to file this under. There was no category. The closest she could find was a flag her threat assessment module had been generating since minute 4 of the engagement, quietly, in the corner of her display where she had not been paying attention. Reclassify contact type. She had not reclassified. She had assumed it was a sensor artifact. She pulled the flag now and read the full assessment. The module, working from 32 minutes of observational data, had concluded that the 9 contacts were not fighter-class assets under any Keth threat taxonomy, not in terms of their threat ceiling, their tactical footprint, or the limiting assumptions about what fighter-sized craft could accomplish against capital ship formations. The module recommended reclassifying them as a new contact type for which no existing category applied. The phrase it used was, insufficient framework. Saya had never seen her tactical computer produce that phrase before. She read it 3 times to make sure her translator had rendered it correctly. It had. She thought about what it meant to have a framework you had trusted for 800 hours of combat suddenly produce a result it could not categorize. She thought about the navigator's silence. She thought about Tethvorik, 41 years old, 7 campaigns, watching the display without speaking. She thought about the human lead's voice, young, she was certain of that now, Not just tonally young, but the specific kind of unafraid that only came from someone who had thought through every scenario, including the worst one, and had decided to fly anyway. That was not recklessness. Recklessness was what you called it when you did not understand the calculation. She understood the calculation now, reading the 32-minute record on her board. The calculation had been perfectly correct. 9 was enough. They had worked it out beforehand and they had been right. She filed a full sensor log of the engagement, every repositioning, every targeting priority, every timing window, and tagged it urgent for fleet intelligence analysis. In the summary field she wrote one observation she was not certain her superiors would appreciate, but which the accuracy of her record required. The most significant datum in the attached log was not the tactical pattern itself. Tactical patterns could be mapped, countered, planned against. The most significant datum was something the sensor log could not directly capture. It was the 4-second pause before the lead had replied to the stand-down order. Not hesitation, not fatigue. Something she had no word for in the Keth tactical lexicon. The pause of someone who had been fully committed to a thing and was, in that quiet moment, simply finishing the commitment before they turned away. As if the decision to return mattered less than the decision to come at all. She closed the summary field. Her stabilizer alarm blinked its muted complaint the whole way home, and she let it blink, and she thought about 9 fighters and 214 warships and a jump point that was not crossed, and about all the things her training archive had told her were not possible, and about the specific, ordinary courage of people who had looked at the number and flown toward it anyway. The Narrows stayed closed. The carrier group held its position for 6 more hours, unhurried, until the Keth column had cleared scanner range entirely. No one came back.